The first time Clara Whitmore saw the Duke of Ashbourne, she was kneeling on the cold stone floor of a creditor's office, picking up scattered coins with fingers numb from more than just the autumn chill. The coins had fallen from her own reticule, a pitiful collection of shillings and pence she had gathered by selling her mother's silver hairbrush, her father's pocket watch, and the last of her good woolen stockings. She had come to beg for 3 more weeks. 3 more weeks to find the money that would keep a roof over her mother's head, and her younger brother's foolish, beloved head from debtor's prison. The door had opened behind her, and she had heard the clerk's voice change, from the flat, dismissive tone he used with her, to something oily and eager. "Your Grace, an unexpected honor. Please, do come in. I shall be but a moment." Clara had not looked up. She had simply continued gathering the coins, one by one, because to look up would have been to show her face, and she was certain her face was not fit to be seen. Her bonnet had slipped back, her hair was coming loose, and there was a smear of mud on the hem of her dress, from walking 3 miles in the rain to save the omnibus fare. She did not need to see the Duke. She could feel him, a tall, still presence by the door, radiating the quiet, unshakable confidence of a man who has never once had to pick a coin off a floor. That was the moment Alexander Ashbourne, 6th Duke of Ashbourne, first saw Clara Whitmore. He had inherited the title 3 years earlier upon his father's death, and in all that time, no one had ever looked at him the way this woman did, or rather, the way she refused to look at him at all. He saw the curve of her spine through the worn grey fabric of her dress, the determined set of her jaw, the way her fingers trembled only slightly as she retrieved the last coin and rose to her feet. She did not curtsy. She simply lifted her chin, looked at the clerk and said, "I will return with the remainder. I give you my word." The clerk, emboldened by the Duke's presence, had sneered. "Your word, Miss Whitmore, is worth less than that handful of copper. If the full amount is not paid by the 1st of November, proceedings will begin to seize the property. I suggest you and your family make other arrangements." Clara had not flinched. She had simply inclined her head, walked past the Duke without meeting his eyes, and stepped out into the rain. And Alexander, who had spent his entire life being pursued by women who smiled at him and flattered him and measured his worth by the size of his fortune, found himself turning to watch her go. He did not know then that this woman, this proud, rain-soaked creature with a handful of coins and a spine of steel, would be the first person in his life to make him question everything he believed about money, about love, and about himself. And he certainly did not know that by the time it was all over, she would have walked away from him twice, broken his heart once, and taught him that the most valuable thing a person can give is not gold, but the freedom to choose. But that was only the beginning. The true beginning started 3 days later, when Alexander Ashbourne arrived at the Whitmore family's modest Somersetshire cottage, with a carriage full of servants, a document that would have cleared every debt the family owed, and the unshakable assumption that any woman in her position would fall at his feet with gratitude. He could not have been more wrong. The cottage was smaller than he had imagined. Alexander stood in the tiny parlour, his head nearly brushing the low ceiling, and felt the walls pressing in around him. The furniture was old and worn, but polished to a shine. The curtains were faded, but clean. A small fire crackled in the hearth, doing its best to chase away the damp that seeped through the stone walls. It was, he thought, a proud little house, a house that refused to surrender despite its circumstances. And Clara Whitmore stood before him, her hands folded in front of her, her expression carefully neutral. She had not offered him tea. She had not smiled. She had simply opened the door, recognized him from the creditor's office, and allowed him inside, as though she were granting him a favor rather than receiving one. "Your Grace," she said now, her voice steady, "I confess I am at a loss to understand your visit. I have no business with the Ashbourne family." Alexander set his case on the small table by the window and opened it. "You have business with the creditors, Miss Whitmore, and I have come to resolve it." He pulled out a document and held it up. "This is a draft for the full amount owed on the cottage. It will be delivered to the creditors this afternoon. Your home is secure." The cottage, not the ancestral estate, that had been lost years ago, but this small, stubborn cottage, protected for decades by the technicality of her mother's dowry, was now the only thing standing between the Whitmore family and complete ruin, and even that, it seemed, was about to be taken from them. He waited for her reaction. He expected tears, perhaps, or stammered thanks, or the kind of odd silence that always followed when he did something generous. Instead, Clara Whitmore looked at the document, then looked at him, and something in her eyes flickered, something sharp and wary and entirely unexpected. "And in return, Your Grace?" she asked quietly. "What would you require in return?" Alexander frowned. The question irritated him. He had ridden 3 hours through miserable weather to offer this woman salvation, and she was treating him as though he were a moneylender demanding his pound of flesh. "I require nothing. This is a gift." "A gift?" "Yes. From a man I have met once. For a family he does not know. To save a house he has never seen until this moment." "Yes." His voice was sharper now. He was not accustomed to having his generosity questioned. Clara was silent for a long moment. Then she did something that surprised him. She laughed. It was not a joyful sound. It was soft and bitter and achingly sad. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said, "but I do not believe in gifts such as this. I believe in conditions, in expectations, in chains made of gratitude that bind a person so tightly they forget who they are." Alexander stared at her. The arrogance that had carried him through the door faltered. "You think I intend to chain you? I think you intend to be generous," she said. "But I also think that a man such as you, a duke, surrounded by people who depend on him, cannot help but expect something in return. Loyalty, perhaps. Obedience. Gratitude that lasts a lifetime." She shook her head. "I cannot give you those things, Your Grace, and I will not accept your money." The refusal struck him like a slap. He had never, not once in his entire life, been refused anything. The sensation was so foreign that for a moment, he literally could not form words. "You would lose your home," he said slowly, as though explaining something to a child. "Your mother would be left with nothing. Your brother would face debtor's prison. All because you are too proud to accept help?" Clara's jaw tightened, and he saw a flash of genuine anger in her eyes. "I am not refusing help," she said. "I am refusing your help. There is a difference." "What difference?" "Your help comes with a weight I cannot carry." She looked at him steadily, and in that moment, Alexander felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "I do not want your fortune, Your Grace. I want the right to build a life that belongs to me." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and unyielding. Alexander closed the case with a snap. His pride, which he had not even known was wounded, now throbbed with indignation. "You are being foolish," he said coldly. "Pride is a poor shield against ruin." "Pride is all I have left." The raw honesty in her voice struck him like a physical blow. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the shadows beneath her eyes, the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the way her hands gripped each other so tightly the knuckles had gone white. She was exhausted. She was terrified. And still, she refused him. It made no sense. It was irrational. It was infuriating. And it was, Alexander realized with a jolt of something that felt dangerously like admiration, magnificent. "If you will not accept the money," he said slowly, "then perhaps you will tell me what you will accept." Clara's gaze did not waver. "Nothing, Your Grace. I will accept nothing from you." And then she walked to the door and opened it, and Alexander had no choice but to leave. But as he stepped outside into the grey afternoon light, he made himself a promise. He would find a way to help Clara Whitmore, whether she wanted him to or not. Not because he cared about her, he told himself, but because no one refused the Duke of Ashbourne. No one. The weeks that followed were unlike any Alexander had ever experienced. He sent a crate of food from the Ashbourne kitchens, fine hams, wheels of cheese, preserves, and wine. It was returned the next day, untouched, with a brief note: "Thank you for your kindness, but we cannot accept." He sent a dressmaker to the cottage, with instructions to outfit Clara and her mother in appropriate mourning clothes. The dressmaker was turned away at the door, before any measurements could be taken, or any fabric ordered. He arranged for a carriage to be made available for their use. The carriage sat outside the cottage for 3 days before it was returned, the horses well fed and groomed, the driver tipped generously with what Alexander suspected was money the family could not spare. Each rejection should have infuriated him. And it did. At first, he raged in private, pacing the length of his study, muttering about stubborn women and misplaced pride. But as the weeks passed, something else began to creep into his anger, a reluctant, bewildering respect. Clara, meanwhile, had not been idle. She had gone back to the creditors herself, armed with nothing but her father's old account books and a desperate, unshakable determination. She had negotiated, begged, really, though she would never have called it that, for additional time. The creditors, seeing little value in a small cottage with a leaking roof and a disputed ownership history, had reluctantly agreed to delay proceedings until the spring. It was not mercy, it was simple calculation. They believed they could extract more money from a family, given time to find it, than from a forced sale in the middle of winter. Clara knew this. She also knew that the reprieve was temporary, but temporary was enough. Temporary gave her time to work, to save, to find some way, any way, to keep the roof over her mother's head. By late November, Alexander had begun making excuses to visit Somersetshire. He told himself he was checking on his own properties in the area, but he always found a reason to drive past the Whitmore cottage. He saw Clara in the garden, her sleeves rolled up, her hands in the soil. He saw her walking to the village with a basket over her arm, her back straight, her step quick. He saw her sitting by the window in the evening, a book in her lap, a candle burning low. She looked tired, she looked worried, but she never looked defeated. One afternoon in early December, nearly 6 weeks after their first meeting, Alexander encountered her in the village. She was coming out of the milliner's shop with a small parcel, and she stopped short when she saw him. "Your Grace," she said, inclining her head, "I was not aware you had business in the village." "I was in the area," he said, which was technically true. He had ridden 3 hours to be in the area. "Might I walk with you?" She hesitated. He could see the war in her eyes, the desire to refuse him fighting against the knowledge that refusing a duke in public would draw attention. Finally, she nodded. They walked in silence for several minutes, the only sound the crunch of their feet on the gravel path. The winter leaves had fallen, leaving the trees bare against the grey sky, and Alexander found himself noticing things he had never paid attention to before. The smell of wood smoke in the air, the distant sound of children playing, the way the cold made Clara's cheeks flush pink. "Why do you keep refusing me?" he asked finally. The question came out more vulnerable than he intended. Clara did not look at him. "I have answered that question, Your Grace. You said you did not want to be chained by gratitude, but I told you, I expect nothing in return." "And you believe that," she said quietly. "I can see that you believe it. But you have never been poor, Your Grace. You have never watched someone accept charity and slowly lose themselves to it. You have never seen a proud man become a shadow because he could no longer provide for his family." There was something in her voice, an old pain, a remembered wound, that made Alexander's chest tighten. "Your father," he said softly. Clara's steps faltered. "What do you know of my father?" "Only what I have heard," Alexander admitted. "That he was a respected gentleman who lost his fortune through bad investments, that he died in debt." "That is the simple version," Clara said. "The truth is more complicated." They had reached the edge of the village, where the road curved up toward the cottage. Clara stopped and turned to face him, and for the first time, Alexander saw something other than wariness in her eyes. He saw grief, deep, old grief that had never fully healed. "My father did not lose his fortune through bad investments," she said. "He lost it because he trusted the wrong man. A man who offered him help when he needed it, who promised to save our family, and who then used that promise to take everything." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard whispers about his father's business dealings, nothing specific, nothing he had ever wanted to examine too closely. Who was this man? Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, very quietly, "His name was Edmund Ashbourne, the previous duke, your father." The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He stared at her, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to breathe. He had known his father was ambitious. He had known the old duke was ruthless in matters of business. But he had never allowed himself to imagine the human cost of that ruthlessness. "That is why I refuse your help," Clara continued, her voice steady despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "Because the Ashbourne family has already taken enough from mine, and I will not let it happen again." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the road, the winter wind swirling around him like a judgment. Alexander did not follow her. He could not. He stood there for a long time, watching her figure grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared over the hill, and he felt something inside him shift, something fundamental, something that would never be the same again. He had come to Somersetshire to prove that he could save Clara Whitmore. Now he realized that he might be the very thing she needed saving from. That night, Alexander sat alone in the study of his London townhouse, a glass of brandy untouched before him, and thought about his father. Edmund Ashbourne, the 5th Duke of Ashbourne, had been a formidable man, ambitious, brilliant, and utterly ruthless in matters of business. He had built the Ashbourne fortune from a respectable country estate into one of the largest in England, and he had done it without apology or mercy. Alexander had admired him. He had wanted to be like him. He had never questioned how his father had achieved his success. Now, for the first time, he began to wonder. He thought about the way his father had spoken of the Whitmore family, never by name, but as an example of what happened to men who were too weak to protect their own interests. He thought about the property in Somersetshire that had once belonged to a branch of the Ashbourne family. He thought about the documents he had seen in his father's study, documents he had never bothered to read. The next morning, he sent for his father's old steward, a grizzled man named Mr. Pemberton, who had served the family for 40 years. "Tell me about the Whitmore family," Alexander said without preamble. "Tell me everything." Pemberton's face went pale. "Your Grace, I am not certain that is wise. Some matters are best left in the past." "I did not ask if it was wise," Alexander said coldly. "I gave you an order." Pemberton bowed his head. "Very well, but I warn you, Your Grace, the truth is not pleasant." And then he told Alexander everything. The Whitmore family had once owned a modest but prosperous estate in Somersetshire, not grand by any means, but comfortable, with good farmland and a small village that depended on it. Clara's father, Mr. Thomas Whitmore, had been a respected country gentleman, beloved by his tenants and devoted to his family. But 20 years ago, a series of bad harvests had left the estate struggling. Mr. Whitmore had borrowed money from a London bank to cover his losses, and when the harvests continued to fail, he had found himself unable to repay the loan. That was when the old Duke had appeared. He had offered to purchase the Whitmore family's oldest and most valuable asset, a tract of ancient woodland that had been in the family for generations, at what seemed like a generous price. The money would cover Mr. Whitmore's debts and leave enough to keep the estate running. But there had been conditions. The woodland, the old Duke had explained, formed part of a larger tract he intended to acquire for the expansion of his mining interests. In order to make the purchase worthwhile, he would need not just the woodland, but also the rights to the stream that ran through the Whitmore property, and the use of a road that crossed the estate's southern boundary. Mr. Whitmore, desperate and trusting, had agreed. He had signed documents that he believed protected his family's interests. He had been wrong. The documents had been written in legal language so dense and convoluted that even a careful reader might have missed the clauses that gave the old Duke the right to purchase the entire Whitmore estate at a fraction of its true value, if the original loan was not repaid in full by a certain date. And the date, cunningly calculated, was impossible to meet. 3 years later, Mr. Whitmore had been forced to watch as the Ashbourne family took possession of the ancestral home, the farmland, and the village. He had been left with nothing but the small cottage where Clara now lived, a cottage that had been part of his wife's dowry, protected by a technicality that even the old Duke could not overcome. He tried to fight it, Pemberton said quietly. Mr. Whitmore, I mean. He went to court, spent every penny he had left on lawyers. But the documents were ironclad. Your father had planned it all from the beginning. He wanted the land because it sat on a coal seam, and he knew the Whitmores would never sell it willingly. The coal was worth a fortune, more than enough to justify every underhanded trick he used to obtain it. Alexander felt sick. The brandy sat untouched before him. and he thought he might never drink again. "Was there anything else?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Any other reason my father was so determined to ruin this family?" Pemberton hesitated. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Alexander saw something flicker in the old man's eyes, something that looked almost like fear. "There were rumors," Pemberton said finally. "But rumors are dangerous things, Your Grace. I would not repeat them." "Tell me," Alexander commanded. Pemberton drew a shaky breath. "They said that your father and Mr. Whitmore had been friends once, close friends, in their youth, and they said that the friendship ended over a woman who chose Mr. Whitmore." He paused. "But that was long ago, Your Grace. And whatever the truth of it, it does not excuse what was done." Alexander sat in silence, processing this new information. His father had been motivated by greed, certainly. The coal seam was too valuable to ignore. But perhaps, underneath the greed, there had been something else. An old wound, an old resentment, a bitterness that had festered for decades until it found expression in the cruelest possible way. The coal and money had given his father the opportunity. The old resentment had made him ruthless enough to exploit it. That, Alexander realized, was a truth he could live with. His father had not been a simple villain, driven by nothing more than avarice. He had been a complicated, wounded man who had allowed his pain to poison everything he touched. And Alexander was determined not to make the same mistake. The winter of 1842 was the coldest Alexander could remember. Snow fell across England in relentless waves from late December through January, blanketing the countryside in white and making travel difficult if not impossible. He spent the long dark weeks at Ashbourne Hall, his family's ancestral seat in Derbyshire, and thought about Clara Whitmore more often than he cared to admit. He thought about the way she had stood before him in that tiny cottage, her back straight, her eyes blazing with defiance. He thought about the way she had walked away from him on the village road, her grief raw and her pride intact. He thought about the way she had laughed, that bitter, heartbreaking laugh, when he offered her the draft that would have saved her home. He should have left her alone. He knew that. She had made her position clear, but something in him refused to let her go. By the first week of January, he had written to his solicitor and asked for a full accounting of the properties that had been taken from the Whitmore family. The list was longer than he had expected, not just the ancestral home, but several farms, a mill, and a stretch of riverfront that had once belonged to Clara's mother. The current value of the properties was staggering. The coal seam his father had discovered had made the Ashbourne family richer than ever, producing a steady stream of income that showed no signs of slowing. And Clara Whitmore, whose family had once rightfully owned the land, was living in a two-room cottage, with a leaking roof, and a dwindling supply of firewood. Alexander felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: shame. He was still wrestling with that shame when Lady Beatrice Ashbourne arrived at the Hall for an unexpected visit in mid-January. Beatrice was Alexander's aunt, his father's younger sister, and she was everything that was expected of a woman of her station: elegant, accomplished, and deeply, quietly dangerous. She had never married, preferring instead to devote her life to the management of the Ashbourne family's social position, and she had opinions about everything. She was also, Alexander knew, one of several advisors appointed to oversee the family settlement, a position that gave her considerable influence over the family's financial affairs. She also had a way of discovering secrets that others wished to keep hidden. "Alexander, darling," she said, sweeping into the drawing room in a swirl of silk and perfume, "I came as soon as I heard you were here. The season is nearly upon us, and we must discuss your plans." Alexander suppressed a sigh. "My plans, Aunt Beatrice, are to remain in Derbyshire until spring." Beatrice's carefully painted eyebrows rose. "Remain in Derbyshire, in the middle of winter, when London is bursting with eligible young ladies who are simply dying to meet the most eligible bachelor in England." She settled herself on the settee and fixed him with a penetrating stare. "What is keeping you here?" Alexander thought of Clara Whitmore, of her steady grey eyes and her unyielding spine. "Nothing," he said. "I simply prefer the quiet." Beatrice did not believe him. Alexander could see it in the calculating gleam of her eyes, but she did not press the matter, not then. She simply began discussing the social calendar, the parties she wished him to attend, the young ladies she had selected for his consideration. He listened with half an ear, nodding when appropriate, and all the while his mind was far away, on a snow-covered cottage in Somersetshire, and a woman who would not accept his help. It was not until early February that he saw Clara again. He had gone to London for a brief business matter, and he had taken a detour through Somersetshire on his way back. He told himself it was to check on the property that had once belonged to the Whitmores and now belonged to him, but he knew the truth. He wanted to see her. The cottage looked smaller under its blanket of snow, the windows dark, the chimney sending up a thin plume of smoke. He sat on his horse for a long moment, watching, trying to summon the courage to approach. And then the door opened, and Clara stepped out. She was wearing a threadbare cloak that had clearly been patched many times, and she was carrying a bucket toward the well. Her movements were quick and efficient, but Alexander could see the way she shivered in the cold, the way her breath formed small clouds in the frozen air. He dismounted and walked toward her. She saw him coming and stopped, her body going still. "Your Grace," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "This is unexpected." "I was passing through," he said, which was not entirely a lie. "I wanted to see how you were faring." "We are faring well, thank you." She shifted the bucket in her hands. "The winter has been harsh, but we have managed." Alexander looked at her, at the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the wind-chapped skin, the stubborn set of her jaw, and felt something twist in his chest. She was not faring well. She was barely surviving, and still, she would not ask for help. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "I know about my father. I know what he did to your family." Clara went very still. The bucket hung from her hand, forgotten. "I know about the loan, and the documents, and the way he took your home," Alexander continued. "I know that everything I have, everything I am, is built on the suffering of your family, and I want to make it right." Clara's eyes searched his face, looking for something. Sincerity, perhaps, or truth. After a long moment she spoke. "How?" she asked simply. "I want to return the property," Alexander said. "The estate, the farmland, the mill, all of it. It should never have been taken from your family. It belongs to you." He expected her to be grateful. He expected relief, or joy, or at the very least surprise. Instead, Clara's expression hardened. "No." Alexander stared at her. "No? No." She set down the bucket and straightened, facing him squarely. "I do not want your property, Your Grace. I do not want your restitution. I do not want anything from you. But it belongs to your family." "It belonged to my family," Clara corrected. Past tense. "My father made mistakes. He trusted the wrong man, and he signed those documents. But I will not spend the rest of my life trying to reclaim what was lost." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but no less firm. "If I take it from you now, I am still allowing the Ashbourne name to determine the shape of my life. I do not want my future decided by what your father did to my family. I want my future to be my own." Alexander shook his head. The frustration was rising again, hot and familiar. "You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met. And you are the most persistent man I have ever met." A ghost of a smile crossed her face, then faded. "But persistence will not change my answer, Your Grace. I will not accept your property. I will not accept your money. I will not accept anything that makes me beholden to you. I am not asking for your gratitude. Aren't you?" Clara's eyes met his, and there was something almost sad in them. "You are a good man, Your Grace. I believe that now. But you have spent your entire life surrounded by people who depend on your generosity. You do not know how to help someone without expecting something in return, even if that something is only their admiration." Alexander opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. Because she was right. He did want her admiration. He wanted her to look at him the way other people looked at him, with respect, with gratitude, with the kind of awe that came from being in the presence of a duke. But Clara Whitmore would never look at him that way, and that, he was beginning to realize, was exactly why he could not stop thinking about her. "Then what do you want?" he asked, the words escaping before he could stop them. "If not money, if not property, if not my help, then what?" Clara was silent for a long moment. The wind picked up, sending snow swirling around them, and Alexander watched as she wrapped her thin cloak more tightly around her shoulders. "I want what my father never had," she said finally. "I want a life that is my own, a life that no one can take from me. I want to build something, something real, something that matters, and I want to do it myself. Without your money, without your influence, without anyone being able to say that I succeeded only because a duke took pity on me." Alexander stared at her, and in that moment, he understood something that would change everything. Clara Whitmore was not afraid of poverty. She was afraid of powerlessness. She was afraid of becoming like her father, dependent on the generosity of others, vulnerable to the whims of those who held her fate in their hands. And no amount of money could cure that fear. Only independence could. "Then tell me what you are building," he said quietly. "I want to understand." Clara studied him for a long moment, as though trying to decide whether she could trust him. Then, slowly, she bent down and picked up the bucket. "Come inside," she said. "It is too cold to stand here talking." And Alexander followed her into the cottage. The fire had burned low, and the room was cold despite the flames. Clara added a few precious sticks of wood, then sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "I want to open a school," she said simply. "A school for girls whose families cannot afford proper education. Girls who are forced to work in factories or service, who have no other choices because they cannot read or write or manage accounts. I want to teach them practical skills: reading, arithmetic, bookkeeping, correspondence, domestic economy, so that they can make their own way in the world, so that they will never be forced to depend on a husband or a relative for their survival." Alexander listened, and for the first time since his father's death, he felt something like hope stir in his chest. "That is why you refused my money," he said slowly. "Because you want to build this school yourself." Clara nodded. "I have been saving for years, selling what little I have, taking work where I can find it. It is slow work, agonizingly slow, but it is mine." "How much have you saved?" Clara hesitated. Then she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, worn account book. She opened it and showed him the numbers written in her careful, precise hand. The total was pathetically small, barely enough to rent a room for 6 months, let alone furnish it or hire a teacher. Alexander felt a familiar urge, the urge to reach into his pocket, to solve the problem with money, to make it all better with a wave of his hand. But he forced himself to stay still. He was learning, slowly, that his instincts were not always right. "It is not much," Clara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it is a beginning." "It is more than a beginning," Alexander said. "It is a foundation." He looked at her across the small table, at the firelight flickering over her features, and he made a decision. "I will not offer you money," he said. "I will not offer you property. I will not offer you anything that makes you feel beholden to me, but I would like to help, if you will let me." Clara's eyes narrowed. "Help how?" "I do not know yet," Alexander admitted. "But I am a duke, Miss Whitmore. I have connections, resources, knowledge, and I am offering those to you freely, without condition, because I believe in what you are trying to do." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. Then, slowly, she closed the account book and set it aside. "I will think about it," she said. It was not a yes, but it was also not a no. And for Alexander Ashbourne, who had spent his entire life getting exactly what he wanted, it was enough. It was the first time in his life that he had ever been willing to wait. Spring came slowly that year, the snow melting into mud, the grey skies giving way to hesitant patches of blue. Alexander returned to London for the season in late March, though his heart was not in it. He attended the balls and parties that his Aunt Beatrice insisted upon, danced with the eligible young ladies who simpered and flattered, and measured his worth by the size of his fortune. And all the while, he thought of Clara Whitmore. He thought of her standing in the cold, her bucket in her hand, her eyes blazing with defiance. He thought of her sitting in the cottage, her account book open before her, her voice steady as she told him about her school. He thought of the way she had looked at him in the creditor's office, all those months ago, proud and unyielding and utterly unforgettable. He began writing to her. Not love letters, nothing so forward, but letters about the practical matters of establishing a school. He sent her information about properties that might be suitable for a classroom, about teachers who might be willing to work for modest wages, about educational materials that could be obtained cheaply. And Clara wrote back. Her letters were brief and businesslike, but they were letters, and Alexander treasured each one like a gift. In May, he visited Somersetshire again, and this time, Clara took him to see the building she had found. It was a small, dilapidated structure on the edge of the village, once a wool merchant's shop, now abandoned and falling into ruin. The roof leaked, the windows were broken, and the floor was rotting in several places. But Clara looked at it with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. "It is not much," she said, "but it is within my budget. The owner is willing to rent it to me for a very reasonable price." Alexander walked through the dusty rooms, noting the damage, the repairs that would be needed, the long months of work that lay ahead. He wanted to offer to pay for everything, to sweep in and make it perfect with his money and his influence. Instead, he said, "It has good bones. With some work, it could be a fine school." Clara turned to him, and for the first time since he had known her, she smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine, and utterly dazzling. "Do you truly think so?" "I do." And in that moment, standing in the dusty ruin of what would one day be Clara's school, Alexander Ashbourne realized, with a certainty that frightened him, that what he felt for her had become love. He did not tell her. He knew she was not ready to hear it. She was still guarded, still wary, still determined to prove that she could build her dream without his help. And he understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that love meant patience. So he returned to London, and he attended more parties, and he listened to his Aunt Beatrice's pointed comments about eligible young ladies and the importance of producing an heir, and he wrote to Clara, and he waited. It was in June that everything began to unravel. Alexander had not told anyone about his connection to Clara Whitmore. He had kept their correspondence private, their meetings discreet, their growing friendship a secret that he guarded like a treasure. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially in the gossip-soaked world of London society. And Lady Beatrice Ashbourne had never been one to overlook a mystery. She came to him one afternoon in the second week of June, her face composed but her eyes sharp with suspicion. "Alexander, darling, I have heard the most peculiar rumor." Alexander looked up from his desk, where he had been reviewing accounts. "What rumor, Aunt Beatrice?" "That you have been seen in Somersetshire on several occasions, in the company of a young woman of no particular family." She seated herself across from him, her silk skirts rustling. "A Miss Whitmore, I believe her name is. The daughter of that unfortunate man who lost everything to your father." Alexander went very still. "What of it?" Beatrice's eyebrows rose. "You do not deny it?" "I do not deny that I have been to Somersetshire. I have business there." "Business with a woman whose father was ruined by our family?" Beatrice's voice was soft, but there was steel beneath it. "Alexander, you must see how this looks. The gossips are already whispering. They say you have been pursuing this woman. They say she has been trying to trap you into marriage." Alexander felt a surge of anger. "Clara Whitmore is not trying to trap anyone. She is a woman of extraordinary integrity and character, and I will not have her name dragged through the mud by idle gossip." Beatrice studied him for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, something cold and calculating that Alexander did not like. "You have feelings for her," she said quietly. It was not a question. Alexander did not answer. "Alexander, listen to me." Beatrice leaned forward, her voice urgent. "I understand that you feel guilty about what your father did. I understand that you want to make amends. But marrying this woman is not the answer. It will not undo the past, and it will destroy your future." "I am not going to marry her," Alexander said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "Aren't you?" Beatrice's eyes were knowing. "I have watched you these past months. You are distracted, distant, utterly uninterested in the eligible young ladies who throw themselves at your feet. And now I discover that you have been secretly corresponding with a woman whose family has every reason to hate us." She shook her head. This is not love, Alexander. This is guilt. And guilt is a poor foundation for a marriage. Alexander felt the truth of her words like a blow. Was that all this was? Guilt? A desperate need to atone for his father's sins? No, it was more than that. It had to be more than that. You do not know Clara, he said quietly. You do not know what she is like. I know enough, Beatrice replied. I know that she is the daughter of a man your father destroyed. I know that she has refused your help on multiple occasions. And I know that you have become obsessed with her precisely because she refuses you. She paused, her voice softening. That is not love, Alexander. That is fascination, and fascination fades. Alexander wanted to argue, but the words would not come, because his aunt was right about one thing. He had never met anyone like Clara Whitmore. She was unlike anyone in his world, and he had been drawn to her, from the very first moment, because she refused him. Was that love? Or was it simply the wounded pride of a man who had never been denied? He did not know, and that uncertainty terrified him. I will not stop seeing her, he said finally. Whatever my feelings are, I need to understand them, and I cannot do that if I am constantly looking over my shoulder, worrying about gossip. Beatrice's lips tightened. Then you leave me no choice. I will do what I must to protect this family, and to protect you from yourself. She rose and left the room, and Alexander sat alone in his study, the weight of her words pressing down on him. He wrote to Clara that night, warning her to be careful, but the letter took 3 days to reach Somersetshire, and by the time it arrived, the damage had already been done. Lady Beatrice had moved faster than he had expected. She had gone to Somersetshire herself, using the pretext of visiting a friend in the area. She had called on the local gentry, attended the village church, and made a point of asking questions about the Whitmore family. And she had spoken to Clara. Alexander did not learn the full details of that conversation until weeks later, but the result was immediate and devastating. Clara stopped writing to him. At first, Alexander thought it was simply a delay in the post. But when a week passed without a letter, he grew concerned. When 2 weeks passed, he grew alarmed. And when 3 weeks passed without a word, by the middle of July, he rode to Somersetshire himself, his heart pounding with a fear he had never felt before. He found Clara in the garden of her cottage, tending to a small vegetable patch. She looked up when she heard his horse, and the expression on her face made his blood run cold. It was not anger, it was not sadness, it was nothing, a blank, empty mask that hid everything she was feeling. Miss Whitmore, he said, dismounting, I have been worried. I have not heard from you in weeks. Clara rose from the garden, wiping her hands on her apron. I have been busy, Your Grace. There is much to do before the school can open. Clara, he took a step toward her, and she took a step back. What happened? Did my aunt speak with you? For a long moment, Clara said nothing. Then, slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Your aunt was very informative, she said quietly. She told me about the settlement, about the conditions attached to your family's fortune. Alexander felt his heart stop. What conditions? She told me that your father established a trust before his death, a trust that controls much of the Ashbourne family's unentailed wealth. The terms of the trust require you to marry a woman approved by the family trustees. If you do not, the unentailed property and investments pass to your cousin. Clara's voice was steady, but her eyes were bright with unshed tears. She told me that if you marry me, you will lose much of your fortune, not the title itself perhaps, but the wealth that supports it. Alexander stared at her. That is not true. Is it not? Clara's gaze searched his face. Can you look me in the eye and tell me that your father did not place conditions on his fortune? Alexander opened his mouth, then closed it. Because he could not. His father's will and settlements were complex documents, full of clauses and conditions and legal intricacies that Alexander had never fully understood. He had assumed that the fortune was his, that it would always be his, as his birthright and his duty. But he had never read the documents himself. He had left that to his solicitors. And now, for the first time, he wondered what those clauses might contain. I do not know, he admitted. I will find out. But whatever the documents say, it does not change how I feel about you. How you feel about me? Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. Your Grace, you do not know how you feel about me. You have spent your entire life surrounded by people who want your money and your title. I am the first person who has refused them. That makes me fascinating to you. A puzzle to be solved. A challenge to be won. But that is not love. It is curiosity. The words were so close to his aunt's that Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. That is not true, he said. Clara, I know what I feel. I love you. The words hung in the air between them, raw and vulnerable. Clara closed her eyes, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. You love the woman who refused you, she said. You love the woman who challenged you. But what will happen when I stop refusing? What will happen when I become just another woman who needs you? She shook her head. I cannot risk it. I cannot risk becoming my mother, dependent on a man who could leave at any moment, with no way to support herself, no way to survive. I would never leave you. You cannot promise that. No one can. Clara opened her eyes, and there was a depth of pain in them that took Alexander's breath away. Your aunt was right about one thing, Your Grace. We come from different worlds, and in your world, a woman like me will always be seen as beneath you. I will always be the poor relation, the charity case, the woman who trapped a duke into marriage. I will spend my life proving that I am worthy of you, and I will fail, because no matter what I do, I will always be the daughter of a man your father destroyed. Clara. Alexander reached for her, desperate to hold her, to make her understand, but she stepped back, out of his reach. I am sorry, she whispered, but I cannot be what you want me to be. I cannot be the woman who accepts your love and your fortune and your protection. I have worked too hard, fought too hard, to become someone who can stand on her own, and I will not give that up. Not for you. Not for anyone. She turned and walked toward the cottage, her back straight, her steps steady. And Alexander, the Duke of Ashbourne, the most powerful man in 3 counties, stood in the garden and watched her go. He did not follow her. He did not call out. He simply stood there, the weight of his father's sins pressing down on him like a physical force, and understood that he had lost her. But he was not ready to give up. Not yet. The weeks that followed were the darkest of Alexander's life. He returned to London and summoned his solicitors, demanding a full review of his father's will and settlements. The review took weeks. Long, agonizing weeks, during which Alexander barely ate, barely slept, barely spoke. He haunted the halls of his townhouse like a ghost, replaying his conversation with Clara over and over in his mind. Had he really told her he loved her? Had he really believed it? Yes, he had. But she had been right about one thing. He had never stopped to examine whether his feelings were real or simply the result of her refusal. He had never stopped to consider whether he loved Clara Whitmore or simply loved the idea of her, the idea of a woman who did not want his money, who did not need his protection, who stood apart from everyone else in his life. He had to know. When the solicitors finally presented their findings in late August, Alexander read through the documents with a sinking heart. Beatrice had been telling the truth, partially. His father had indeed established a settlement before his death, and that settlement did contain conditions regarding Alexander's marriage. The trustees, a panel of respectable gentlemen appointed by his father, with Lady Beatrice serving as an advisor, were required to approve any potential bride. If Alexander married without their approval, certain unentailed properties and investments would pass to his cousin. But the conditions were not as ironclad as Beatrice had made them seem. The trustees had broad discretion to approve any woman they deemed suitable, and suitability, the documents made clear, was based on character and reputation, not on family fortune or social standing. Furthermore, Alexander discovered that Beatrice had deliberately concealed the full truth. She had known about the trustees' discretionary powers. She had attended the meetings where they were discussed, but she had chosen to present the conditions as absolute and unchangeable. She had lied to Clara, not about the existence of the settlement, but about its meaning. She had made it seem as though Alexander would be ruined if he married a woman like Clara, when in truth, the trustees had the power to approve any woman of good character. And Clara, trusting Beatrice's word, had believed her. Alexander sat in his study, the documents spread before him, and felt a cold fury building in his chest. His aunt had deliberately tried to destroy the only chance he had ever had at happiness. She had lied, manipulated, and schemed, all in the name of protecting the family. But she had failed, because Alexander was not going to give up. Not now, not ever. The next morning, Alexander did something he had never done before. He went to see his aunt. Lady Beatrice was in her morning room, drinking tea and reading a novel. She looked up when he entered, and her eyebrows rose in surprise. "Alexander, this is unexpected." "I know what you did," he said quietly. "I know you went to Somersetshire. I know you spoke to Clara. I know you told her about the settlement." Beatrice's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. "I did what was necessary to protect this family." "You lied to her," Alexander said. "You told her that I would lose everything if I married her. But that is not what the settlement says, is it?" Beatrice was silent. "I read the documents, Aunt Beatrice. I read every word. The trustees have the power to approve any woman of good character. There is nothing in the settlement that requires me to marry a woman of fortune or high birth." Alexander's voice was cold. "You deliberately misled her. You deliberately tried to destroy the only chance I have ever had at happiness." Beatrice's lips tightened. "I was trying to save you from yourself." "No. You were trying to control me. You have always tried to control me, to shape me into the man you think I should be. But I am not your puppet, Aunt Beatrice. I am the Duke of Ashbourne, and I will make my own choices." Beatrice rose to her feet, her face pale with fury. "You ungrateful boy. Everything I have done has been for you, for this family. Do you have any idea what people will say if you marry that woman? The scandal? The shame? Her father was destroyed by your father. Everyone knows the story. They will say you married her out of guilt, and they will laugh at you behind your back for the rest of your life." "Let them laugh," Alexander said. "I would rather be laughed at and loved than respected and alone." Beatrice stared at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "You will regret this," she whispered. "Mark my words, Alexander. You will regret throwing away everything for a woman who will never truly love you. She will always resent you. She will always see you as the son of the man who destroyed her family. And one day, you will wake up and realize that you gave up everything for nothing." "Then I will deal with that when it comes," Alexander said. "But I will not spend my life wondering what might have been. I will not become like my father, bitter, angry, consumed by old wounds and missed opportunities. I will choose love, Aunt Beatrice, even if it costs me everything." He turned and walked out, leaving Beatrice standing in her morning room, her tea growing cold, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Alexander rode to Somersetshire that same day. He did not stop to rest, did not stop to eat. He rode through the night, driven by a desperate, burning need to see Clara, to tell her the truth, to beg her forgiveness, to prove that he had finally understood. He arrived at the cottage just before dawn, his horse lathered and exhausted, his body aching with fatigue, but he did not hesitate. He dismounted, and walked to the door and knocked. Clara opened it a moment later, wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders. She stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. "Your Grace? What are you doing here? It is barely morning." "I had to see you." Alexander's voice was hoarse. "I had to tell you the truth." Clara's expression hardened. "I have heard enough of your truths, Your Grace." "Not this one." He reached into his coat and pulled out a bundle of papers, the documents from his solicitors, the evidence of his aunt's deception. "I know what my aunt told you. I know she said that I would lose everything if I married you. But she lied, Clara. The settlement does not require me to marry a woman of fortune or high birth. It requires me to marry a woman of good character, and there is no woman of better character in all of England than you." Clara stared at the papers, her face pale. "I do not understand." "My aunt is one of the advisors to the trustees," Alexander explained. "She knew about the conditions, and she deliberately misrepresented them, to make you believe that our marriage would destroy me. She wanted to drive you away, Clara. She wanted to protect what she saw as the family's interests. But she was wrong, and I have come to tell you that nothing, not her lies, not my father's sins, not the gossip of London society, Nothing will keep me from you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out another paper, this one a record of transactions, carefully documented. "And there is something else," he said quietly. "Something I discovered while I was reviewing my accounts. You have been repaying me, Clara, for the expenses I incurred trying to help your family, the cost of the food I sent, the carriage, the other expenses I incurred attempting to assist you. You have been repaying everything anonymously through a solicitor in Bath." Clara went very still. "How did you find out?" "It does not matter how. What matters is what it taught me." He took a step toward her, and this time, she did not step back. "I have been a fool. I thought I was different from my father, but I was still trying to solve everything with money. I was still trying to buy your love, your gratitude, your loyalty, even when I told myself I was not." "Alexander," Clara began, but he shook his head. "Let me finish. Please." He drew a shaky breath. "You told me that you wanted to build a life that belonged to you, and I did not understand what that meant. I thought it meant you were too proud to accept help, but now I understand. You did not want my help, because you did not want to owe me anything. You wanted to stand beside me, not beneath me." Clara's eyes glistened with tears, but she did not look away. "I cannot undo what my father did to your family," Alexander continued. "I cannot give you back what was taken. But I can promise you this. From this moment forward, I will never try to buy your love. I will never try to solve your problems with money. I will simply be here, as a man who loves you, who respects you, who wants nothing more than to walk beside you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a simple gold ring, not a family heirloom, not a fortune in diamonds, but a plain band that could have belonged to any working man in England. "I am not offering you a fortune," he said quietly. "I am not offering you a title, or an estate, or a life of luxury. I am offering you myself, my heart, my loyalty, my respect. And I am asking, not demanding, not expecting, but asking, if you would do me the honor of being my wife." The silence stretched between them, long and fragile. And then Clara did something Alexander had never seen her do before. She smiled through her tears. "You ridiculous man," she whispered. "I did not want a fortune. I did not want a title. I wanted you to see me as your equal, and you have finally done it." She reached out and took the ring from the box, sliding it onto her finger. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you. Not because I need you, and not because you need me, but because we choose each other, freely, and without conditions." Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her as though he would never let go. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of a small cottage in Somersetshire, surrounded by the soft light of dawn, he understood something that he had been searching for his entire life. True wealth was not measured in money, or property, or titles. It was measured in love, in respect, in the freedom to choose. And Clara Whitmore had given him all three. They were married in the autumn of 1843, in a small ceremony at the village church, surrounded by the people Clara had grown up with, farmers and tradesmen, and servants who had watched her struggle and persevere, and refused to give up on her dreams. Lady Beatrice was not invited. She had retreated to the family's estate in Scotland, where she remained for the rest of her days, bitter and alone. But even in her exile, she never acknowledged that she had been wrong. She died 3 years later, still convinced that she had been protecting the family, still unable to see that the family she had been protecting was not the one that mattered. Clara's mother, who had been ill for so long, rallied enough to attend the wedding. She wept through the ceremony, but they were tears of joy, joy at seeing her daughter happy, joy at seeing the family's long nightmare finally come to an end. Before the ceremony, she had taken Alexander aside and looked at him with eyes that had seen too much sorrow. "My daughter does not need a man to save her," she said quietly. "If you love her, make certain you never ask her to become smaller so that you can feel larger." Alexander had taken her hand and promised. It was a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life. And Clara's brother Thomas, who had made mistakes in the past, stood proudly beside his sister, a changed man. Alexander had initially considered helping him financially, but Clara had insisted otherwise. Give him work, not charity, she had said. He needs to earn his own way, just as I have. So Alexander had offered Thomas a position managing one of the Ashbourne estates, not as a gift, but as honest employment. Thomas had accepted gratefully, and in the years that followed, he proved himself capable and diligent, slowly rebuilding the reputation he had nearly destroyed. The school opened 6 months later, in the spring of 1844. The initial school was modest, its expenses covered by Clara's own savings, and the earnings she had accumulated through years of careful work. The building was still small, the roof still sometimes leaked, and the classroom was furnished with second-hand tables and chairs. But it was hers. Every desk, every book, every slate had been paid for with money she had earned herself. Only later, when the school had proven its worth, and Clara had established herself as a capable administrator, did Alexander establish a separate charitable trust to help expand the work. The trust was completely independent of his personal fortune, with Clara given full control over its educational mission. "This is not my gift to you," Alexander had told her when he established the trust. "It is an investment in the future you saw before I did." And Clara, understanding, had accepted. The school grew slowly at first, then more quickly as word spread. Girls came from all over the county, factory workers, servants, farmers' daughters, eager to learn the skills that would give them choices in a world that offered so few. Clara taught them reading, arithmetic, bookkeeping, correspondence, and practical skills that would allow them to support themselves, and she taught them something else too, that they were worthy of respect, worthy of dignity, worthy of a life that belonged to them. Alexander watched her work with a quiet wonder that never faded. She was extraordinary, not because of her beauty, or her grace, or her intelligence, though she possessed all three, but because of her fierce, unyielding commitment to the belief that every person deserved the chance to choose their own path. It was the same belief that had made her refuse his fortune all those months ago, and it was the same belief that had made him fall in love with her. Years passed. The school expanded, opening new locations throughout the county and beyond. Clara's reputation grew, not as the Duchess of Ashbourne, but as a woman who had built something real and lasting from nothing but determination and hope. She was asked to speak at meetings of education reformers, to advise on the establishment of similar schools, to lend her voice to the growing movement for women's education. And through it all, Alexander stood beside her, not as her benefactor, not as her protector, but as her partner, her equal, her friend. It was not always easy. There were still moments when his instinct was to solve problems with money, to sweep in and make things right with a wave of his hand. But Clara taught him patience. She taught him trust. She taught him that sometimes the greatest gift was simply believing in someone enough to let them succeed on their own terms. And Alexander taught her something too, that not all men were like his father, that it was possible to love someone without owning them, to support someone without controlling them, to give freely without expecting anything in return. It was not the life either of them had imagined. It was better. The final scene took place on a warm summer evening, 10 years after their wedding. The newest school building was opening in a village on the northern edge of the county. A proper building this time, with large windows and a sturdy roof, and a classroom that could hold 60 girls. Clara had overseen every aspect of its construction, from the placement of the desks to the selection of the books, and she stood at the front of the room, addressing a group of students who had gathered for the opening ceremony. Alexander stood in the doorway, watching her. She was no longer the tired, worried woman he had first met in a creditor's office. She was confident, radiant, alive with purpose. Her hair was threaded with silver now, and there were lines around her eyes, but she had never been more beautiful. One of the girls raised her hand. "Your Grace," she asked, using the title with the easy familiarity of someone who had known Clara all her life. "Is it true that you once refused to become rich?" Clara smiled, and Alexander felt his heart swell with love. "It is true," she said. "Many years ago, before I married, I was offered a fortune, a very large fortune, and I refused it." The girls gasped, and whispered among themselves, and Clara laughed. "Why?" one of them asked. "Why would you refuse a fortune?" Clara was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the doorway where Alexander stood. Their eyes met, and he saw in her expression all the love and trust and understanding that had grown between them over the years. "Because being wealthy was never my greatest dream," she said softly. "Having a choice was." The words hung in the air, simple and profound. Alexander felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He thought of all the years he had spent trying to buy her love, all the money he had offered, all the gifts she had refused. He thought of the moment he had finally understood that true love was not about what one person could provide for the other, but about respecting each other's dignity, dreams, and freedom. And he thought of the woman standing before him, who had taught him that lesson with every word she spoke, every choice she made, every breath she took. Clara continued speaking, her voice strong and sure. "When I was a girl, my father lost everything because he trusted the wrong person. He lost his home, his land, his sense of himself, and I watched it happen. I watched him become a shadow of the man he had once been, because he no longer had the power to choose his own future." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each girl in turn. "That is why I built this school," she said. "That is why I have spent my life trying to give you something that no one can take away, the ability to choose. Whether you marry or remain single, whether you work in a factory or run your own business, whether you stay in this village or travel the world, your life should be your own. No one should be able to take that from you." The girls were silent, their young faces filled with a mixture of awe and determination. Alexander understood that feeling. He had felt it himself, the first time Clara had looked at him and refused his help. She had given him something that day, something he had not even known he was missing. She had given him the chance to become a man who was loved for himself, rather than his title. After the ceremony, Alexander and Clara walked through the village together, their arms linked, the summer sun warm on their faces. They did not speak for a long time, content simply to be in each other's presence. Finally, Clara said, "You were watching me." "I always watch you," Alexander replied. "You are the most captivating woman I have ever known." Clara laughed softly. "Even after 10 years of marriage." "Especially after 10 years of marriage." He squeezed her arm. "Every day, I discover something new about you. Every day, I fall in love with you a little more." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "You are a hopeless romantic, Alexander Ashbourne. Only with you." They walked in silence for a while longer, passing through the village green and into the narrow lanes beyond. Children played in the fields, their laughter floating on the breeze. A farmer led his cart down the road, nodding respectfully as they passed. The whole world seemed to glow with the golden light of late afternoon. "I was thinking," Clara said eventually, "about the first time we met." Alexander winced. "In the creditor's office, I remember." "I was so ashamed," Clara said quietly. "I was on my knees, picking up coins from the floor, and I knew you were watching me. I wanted to disappear." "I did not see shame," Alexander said. "I saw dignity. I saw strength. I saw a woman who refused to be broken, even when everything was falling apart around her." Clara looked up at him, her eyes soft. "Is that when you fell in love with me?" "No," Alexander admitted. "That is when I became intrigued by you. I fell in love with you later, when you refused my help, when you returned my gifts, when you told me that you wanted to build a life that belonged to you." He paused, a smile tugging at his lips. "I fell in love with you in 1,000 small moments, each one teaching me something new about who you are." Clara smiled back at him. "And I fell in love with you when you stopped trying to buy me and started trying to understand me." They reached the edge of the village, where the road curved up toward the cottage, where Clara's mother still lived. The old woman was doing well, her health improved by years of proper care, and the joy of watching her daughter succeed. She would be waiting for them, Alexander knew, with tea and cake and endless questions about the ceremony. But for now, in this moment, it was just the two of them. "I have something to tell you," Clara said suddenly. "Something I should have told you long ago." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object, a gold locket, old and worn, with the Ashbourne crest engraved on the front. "I found this among my father's things after he died," she said quietly. He had kept it all those years, hidden in a drawer. A reminder, he said, of the day his life changed forever. Alexander stared at the locket, recognition dawning. That was my father's. He lost it years before his death. He always wondered what had become of it. Clara nodded. He gave it to my father as a token of friendship. They had known each other as young men. Did you know that? Before the money, before the land, before everything. She opened the locket, revealing a small portrait inside. This was inside. Alexander looked at the portrait and felt his breath catch. It was a miniature painting of a young woman with grey eyes and a determined expression, a face he recognized instantly. It was Clara's mother, in the bloom of her youth. My father told me the story before he died, Clara said. Your father and my father were friends once. Close friends. And then they both fell in love with the same woman. My mother chose my father, and your father never forgave either of them. Alexander felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him. All this time, he had believed his father was motivated purely by greed, by the cold, calculating pursuit of wealth. But now, looking at the locket in Clara's hand, he understood that the truth was more complicated. His father had been driven by both. The coal seam had given him the opportunity. The old resentment had made him ruthless enough to exploit it. The money had been the prize, but the revenge had been the satisfaction. Why are you telling me this now? He asked quietly. Clara looked up at him, her eyes clear and steady. Because I wanted you to understand, she said. Your father was not a monster. He was a man who let his feelings consume him, who allowed love to turn into something dark and destructive. He could not bear to see the woman he loved happy with someone else, and that bitterness poisoned everything he did. She paused. I wanted to make sure that never happens to us. Alexander pulled her into his arms, holding her close. It will not, he said fiercely. I promise you, Clara. I will never let my love for you become a weapon. I will never use it to control you, or hurt you, or take away your freedom. I will love you as you deserve to be loved, freely, without conditions, without expectations. Clara smiled against his chest. I know, she whispered. That is why I married you. They stood there for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, the summer evening settling around them like a blessing. And somewhere in the distance, a bell rang out from the village church, marking the end of another day and the beginning of another tomorrow. For Clara and Alexander, there would be many tomorrows, each one a new chapter in a story that had begun with a handful of coins on a cold stone floor and ended with a love that was greater than any fortune. It was, they both knew, the only ending that could ever have been. And it was theirs. Now I want to ask you something. If you were in Clara's position, standing before a duke who offered you everything, would you have refused his fortune? Or would you have accepted his help and hoped that love would follow? Tell me in the comments below. I am genuinely curious to know what you would have done. If this story made you feel something, please leave a like. It helps more people discover these tales of love, pride, and redemption. And if you have not already subscribed, join us now. Every week, I bring you a new historical romance, filled with dukes and duchesses, heartbreak and healing, and love stories that will stay with you long after the final word. Share this video with a friend who loves romance as much as you do. And as always, thank you for listening. Until next time.